Hi, thanks for deciding to watch our presentation. I'm Dan Hickey. I'm a professor with the Learning Sciences program. Charmaine Lamb is a PhD student with the Higher Education and Student Affairs program, both at Indiana University. This paper, Centering Transfer for Culturally Sustaining Educational Assessment, was presented at AERA 2022 as part of a larger symposium on culturally sustaining educational ecosystems. I'd like to start by saying thanks to our other collaborators who've helped out on this work. Diane Lamb co-authored a chapter in the forthcoming Handbook of Educational Psychology, which this new paper really draws quite directly from. Morgan Wow worked closely and provided some of the examples in the pilot work here. Morgan is currently a PhD student at IU, along with other current and former students at Indiana University. I want to start by reminding folks of some things that really provided some of the inspiration early in my career for the work I'm going to talk about today. I did my postdoctoral fellowship at the Center for Performance Assessment at ETS in the 90s. And just then, people were really coming to grips with what had been happening in testing. There you see on the upper left as an example of the kind of kindergarten readiness test that was used in the well into the 70s to determine whether kids were ready for kindergarten, as Laurie Shepard really taught me early on. Right, so a teacup and a saucer, right? If a kid didn't know that a teacup went with a saucer, they weren't ready for kindergarten. Well, to a lot of kids, that teacup was more likely something that they used to dip soup out of the pan over there on the left. And then moving on, there you have an actual item from the SAT, the kind of thing that Asa Hilliard pointed out was really super biased. The correct answer to that item is oarsman is to regatta, clearly biased towards particular populations. So I have been studying these issues through the lens of transfer through much of my career, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with the notion of the transfer of learning. And I'm going to draw very strongly on the work of the late Randy Engle, as I have done for quite a few years now. And the bottom line is, otherwise, sort of instruction is wasted. So, the National Research Council puts out these regular expert consensus reports that really do capture nicely what a group of carefully selected experts think about a particular topic. And the Knowing What Students Know report in 2001 really still holds. It basically laid out a pretty strong consensus view of the nature of transfer without getting into the more partisan views of transfer that I'll talk about today. This lays out the assumption that transfer has a profound impact on education via its impact on educational assessments and achievement tests. It's worth noting that in most settings, assessments really are proxies for transfer. It's very difficult to actually measure true problem-solving transfer in many settings, and I'll return to that. It's a very important issue for us today. So another NRC report, How People Learn Too, that came out in 2018, what this report presented was a very strong consensus among leading cognitive scientists that not only do culture and context matter, they matter a lot more than a similar group of experts concluded 2 decades earlier in HPL1. In HPL2, they put it right there in the title, and they had an entire chapter. But what remains unclear is what are the implications of the expectation that context and culture matter for instruction. As a consensus report, HPL 1 and 2 don't really get into the trenches of what particular ways of thinking about what culture and context mean for learning. So I'm going to present today a fairly partisan response to the open question raised in HPL 2 as it relates to assessment and equity. So transfer and assessment, well, they really do have the potential to serve as obstacles to culturally relevant education. The paper that Charmaine and I are presenting today builds on a chapter in the Handbook of Educational Psychology where we really begin to look at transfer of learning really for one of the first times through a lens of equity and inclusion. That chapter summarizes the broad consensus over the failure of deficit-based responses to historical and continuing inequities and justice, and documents really the broad support for a range of asset-based responses. And the one that I'll be focusing on most today is the connected and productive disciplinary engagement framework that Priyanka Agarwal and Tesha Sengupta-Irving introduced in a 2018 ICLS paper, and that was further refined and transformed and published in Cognition and Instruction in 2019. So Rebecca Neary characterized the resistance to culturally relevant education as a multi-level learning problem. Point out that teachers should possess practical pedagogies that effectively draw on racial, ethnic, linguistic, and cultural assets that diverse learners bring to schools. But they also pointed out that teacher resistance to culturally relevant education is a multi-level problem. So what I'm going to talk about today in my paper is one level of this multi-level problem, and that specifically relates to classroom assessment, in particular different levels of classroom assessment ranging from very informal teacher assessment of classroom discourse ranging to formal classroom assessments such as exams and other sort of semi-high stakes tests. And that's paired with work that Rebecca will be presenting in the symposium on educational data uses and work that Jennifer Randall is presenting in the symposium on external achievement tests. So most of the ideas that I'll talk about today emerged in pretty intensive iterative refinement, design-based research using a course that I've been teaching since 2005 called Assessment in Schools. When I moved this course online in 2009, a framework for online instruction that I started calling participatory learning and assessment emerged, embedding Randy Engle's design principles for productive disciplinary engagement, as I'll elaborate, within this multi-level assessment framework that I've been working on really for about a decade at that point. And in 2012, embraced the expansive framing principles I'll be talking about. And one of the things about this course is I typically teach it in the summer when I'm traveling. And I'm pretty busy and I can't spend a ton of time sort of interacting with students one-on-one. I put in plenty of time, but I need to be prepared for this course to do fine when I'm unavailable for stretches of time. So it's very interactive. Students completing asynchronous assignments against regular weekly deadlines. The central goal of that work in my online pedagogy is minimizing the amount of private grading and private instructor feedback and maximizing the amount of public instructor interaction with students. So I piloted some of the features, what I'll call sort of CSCA version 1 in 2019, and I'll talk about this, sort of made an important stumble, responded to that in 2020 and 2021. And I'm currently in the midst of revising this course for summer 2022. And out of this has emerged this new set of principles that I'm calling culturally sustaining educational assessment. So central to the PLA framework is Engle's notion of productive disciplinary engagement. This is both a situative framework for characterizing and studying engagement in terms of engagement in discourse, and discourse that is both disciplinary about the discipline at hand and productive in ways that we are confident will support learning. But this is also a set of design principles for fostering PDE, and first and foremost is this idea that learners should problematize instructional content from their own perspectives. So for example, in the P507 class, the very first assignment has students draft a personally relevant curricular aim, for either an actual or an imagined curricular aim that captures what they care about in education. Most of these teachers in this class are practicing educators, many preparing to be administrators. Not only do they define a personally relevant curricular aim, they define a context in which that aim will be delivered, and then they use that aim, and context to really contextualize most of their learning in the remainder of the course. When you problematize learning in this way, you give students authority to solve the problems that result, right? So the student in the class who's talking about, an algebra objective is the only person in the class who's talking about that objective and becomes the de facto authority about the intersection of the curricular aims of the course and their own self-selected curricular aim for their teaching. When you do that successfully, you can hold students accountable to the discourse of their discipline and accountable to each other. So a lot of this is about fostering these productive forms of disciplinary engagement that are really responsive to the discipline. Arguably, the PDE is among the most useful and used frameworks for studying engagement and for fostering engagement to emerge from situative theories of cognition. Starting in 2012, with the publication of a really important article in Educational Psychologist and a special issue on new conceptualizations of transfer, Randy and colleagues introduced the notion of expansive framing. This is a new set of design principles for framing instruction to support transfer. And this contrasts with bounded framing, where there's really no frames, as well as with what I call expert framing. And this is common in problem-based learning and anchored instruction, where experts come together and define what they think is an ideal sort of context and problematization for learners. So expansive framing suggests that students should be pragmatically pushed to make numerous personalized connections with both content and context, and including the social aspects of both. That's a very important part of this particular contribution. The way this happens is you ask students to contextualize their learning by finding references and making references to people, places, topics, and times beyond the boundaries of the course. And again, this helps position students as authors rather than consumers of disciplinary knowledge. If you succeed in this, they're participating in extended conversations. With a student in P507 who can imagine their prior experience with assessment and with teaching this curricular aim and their future application in their own instruction, if you do this right, that becomes one sort of encompassing context and establishes a state known as intercontextuality, where they're no longer completing an assignment for class, but they're participating in a larger intellectual conversation that extends over time and space. And as I explained, as I wrote in a paper that I prepared with high school teachers that I've been working with for years, it was really written for very entry-level readers. The theory is pretty complicated, but the basic idea is pretty simple. If you want students to use the ideas they're learning in the future, i.e. transfer, they must discuss doing so while they are learning those ideas. So this is how this is operationalized in the assignments in P507. I'm going to focus on one example assignment, helping students create short answer items using guidelines in the textbook. So each assignment, students publicly in what we call a Wikifolio, they're first instructed to reiterate their curricular aim and context after reading the chief chapter outcome, and then sort of reflect on that in light of that outcome. Then they're asked to create example items for their curricular aim using the general item writing guidelines in Chapter 6 and the more specific item writing guidelines in Chapter 7. And then importantly, and this is a key routine in this approach, is that students are asked to summarize and rank the guidelines. So this way that by this time, by this assignment, they've been pushed to really understand what relevance means. Like, why is a particular guideline relevant to you? Well, it might be most relevant to you because it's something you didn't know and you did something very differently, right? So you're really pushing them to make these connections, to talk about their context, their peers, and to interact with other students who are doing the same. So the aforementioned PLA, or Participatory Learning and Assessment Framework that I mentioned, it emerged when we embedded Randy's design principles for PDE within this multi-level assessment framework that emerged in my earlier work with educational multimedia and video games. And so So the instructor comments on these student wikifolios really represent the first immediate level assessment. It's informal assessment of student engagement. And this is where I put a vast majority of my time as an instructor in the course. When students complete each assignment, they prepare a reflection to very carefully worded reflection prompts. And what makes this a very situative approach is that the broader view of learning that comes from situative theory allows you to frame those reflections as a summative assessment of their prior engagement, which justifies using them to award students points for completing the assignment. And in my case, I spend literally 5 minutes a week grading student work. But basically just look, if they've completed the assignment and their reflections are coherent, they get all their points. And usually my only comment in the grade book is says, great job, see my new comments on your work. But they're also a formative assessment of students' understanding. And this formative function occurs in two ways. One is a relatively conventional way, whereby students are reflecting on concepts that they've been learning. But the other one is in a situative way, drawing on Michael Cole's ideas of prolepsis, because students know that they're going to be reflecting on specific aspects of their work. They're inclined to engage in that way in anticipation of those reflections. And that's really central to the work I'm going to be talking about today, the examples. Each assignment is concluded with a proximal self-assessment. These are not only completed privately, but these are a more formal representation, a more decontextualized representation of the knowledge in the form of a short answer item. These are summative assessments of their understanding, so they help motivate student engagement. Students know that they're going to be completing these self-assessments. They don't take any instructor time, but you tell the students, hey, you really should be able to write a coherent answer to this item if you engage in this assignment. But these are also a formative assessment of their achievement, because after preparing an answer using whatever resources they need, they get to compare that answer with a very detailed answer explanation. It's a really good time to introduce some really key concepts that you want students to take away and to transfer from the class that are really anchored to this assessment practice. Then finally, at the end of each module is what I call a discrete achievement test. They're discrete in that they're also private, but they're not worth very many points, just enough to motivate students and to assign grades, but they're also never taught directly to. We take great pains to make sure that each of these levels is not directly preparing students for the next level, but they're aligned enough so that students know that if they engage with the formative assessments, they can transfer that knowledge in productive ways to the achievement test. These are typically time limited. They include best answer items that can't be searched. And if you give students 2 minutes per item, and make sure that the assessments are challenging enough so that no more than one student gets a perfect score, these assessments can serve as a proxy for transfer and can motivate student engagement. And again, absolutely minimizing the amount of private instructor interaction because they're automatically graded in the learning management system. So we began transforming P507 and really in 2019 in response to a really brilliant critique of the CPDE framework and by extension expansive framing in a 2018 ICLS paper by Priyanka Agarwal and Tesha Sengupta-Irving, and a subsequent revision of that approach in 2019. They first acknowledged that PDE is more inclusive than traditional instruction, right? Because students naturally are going to be able to transfer in their diverse histories and identities and ways of knowing. But then really the beauty of this piece is they go through the 4 principles of PDE and each one explain why the overwhelming evidence, the way that power and privilege and social authority really positions out and sidelines students who identify with minoritized communities. Right, so challenging dominant ways of knowing can lead to racial controversies, and that can be problematic if not handled. The really powerful one for me is that social authority that comes with power and privilege can overwhelm intellectual authority. In response, they introduced there's the 2018 version of what they called connected and productive disciplinary engagement, taking each of the 4 design principles, sort of remixing them to address these concerns. They use the term sociopolitical controversies in 2018. They use the term disciplinary uncertainties in 2019. And I'm going to combine those together into what I'm calling a sociopolitical uncertainty for reasons that I'll elaborate. And when you do this, you can curb undue social authority, you create a framework for ensuring equitable accountability, and you can treat this is accomplished by treating sociopolitical controversies / uncertainties as resources. This slide really captures really what we've been struggling with for really a couple of years now, which is taking Engle's 5 explanations of expansive framing and the 2012 piece of why expansive framing should lead to generative learning that transfers readily and widely, and extending each of those with the CPDE principles. So I'm going to take a few minutes here and go through each of these, and then I'll go back through some of these with some examples. The first is that expansive framing should create more intercontextuality. When you push students to make these numerous connections with prior experience and future contexts, they're no longer completing an assignment for the purpose of class, but rather they're participating in this broader conversation. Again, much like when you're working on a scholarly paper and you're really connecting with your prior work, what you think you'll do in the future, right? This is what we do. Well, you can really let students do that in class if you do it right and then make those connections, or at least get a bit of it. So if you include sociopolitical uncertainties in your assignments, you can foster additional intercontextuality that relates to more diverse contexts. So in the example I'll show you, we've taken the short answer item that I've shown you before, that assignment, and extended it to ask students to create a short answer item for students who identify with minoritized communities. The second explanation of expansive framing is that students are more likely to recognize the relevance of the learned content in the transfer context. So a student in P507 who has thought deeply about their own course when they're applying guidelines for creating short answer items is more likely to recognize the relevance of that the next time they do it, if they've connected it to their own practice. So again, if you extend it to think about sociopolitical uncertainties, they're going to not only recognize transfer opportunities in the majoritized context, because by extension, they're going to understand in this case, the guidelines for developing short answer items better, but they're also going to recognize opportunities to apply those guidelines when they are actually, say, developing items for minoritized students. And so the additional problematization that happens by thinking about them twice really deepens their understanding of the core content. And I'll return to that with a nice example. So the third explanation of expansive framing is transfer in. Right? If students are encouraged to problematize from their own perspective, they're going to likely to transfer in their unique prior knowledge and for it to be socially desirable. Other people recognize that people are bringing unique experiences and identities to make sense of things. Well, if you've used sociopolitical uncertainties, you create opportunities for students with minoritized identities to bring their unique experience into an assignment where other peers can recognize that unique perspective has value. The fourth explanation is accountability to content, right? So if you have engaged in authoring new knowledge in the learning environment, you're going to be more comfortable authoring around that knowledge in the transfer environment, right? So if you have, when you've created new assessment assignments or new assessments for short answer items, as I'll show you. If you've successfully positioned students as authors of that knowledge about how those guidelines relate to those items, well, next time they do that in a transfer setting, they're going to be more accountable to what they've learned. Again, if you've done this, if you've succeeded in using sociopolitical uncertainties, that's going to be associated with that content learned in that context. And then finally, the fifth example is generalization of authoring. I'm going to shift gears in my example here and refer to Charmaine. And this refers to if students have numerous opportunities in a class or across classes to author new content, students are going to take away a more general disposition towards authoring. So case in point, so Charmaine and I wrote this paper while Charmaine was completing an advanced seminar on transfer of learning that was currently wrapping up. And it was the third expansively framed course where she really took full advantage of just numerous opportunities to make connections between learning and cognition, assessment in schools, and transfer of learning as they relate to her major in higher education and student affairs. Explanation number 5 suggests that that disposition should generalize to other content. So she took an online course on educational law that wasn't particularly expansively framed. When writing in her dissertation in a new context about that content, she's more likely, because of the experience of authoring in the expansively framed courses, to engage, perhaps even with that other content, more like an author. So again, if you've included multiple socio-political controversies or uncertainties in your course, all students should come away with more confidence authoring new knowledge about socio-political uncertainties, perhaps even in contexts that aren't related, in this case, to educational assessment. So now what I'd like to do is show how we put these ideas into place across a series of refinements of P507. What I'm calling version 1 of culturally sustaining educational assessment was directly in response to something that happened in the 2018 section of the course. One of the students posted in the anonymous course evaluations a really bitter complaint about how politically correct the instructor and the textbook were and many classmates, and that the student was unable to even imagine applying the concepts in the course in their own professional setting. And indeed, the student was so silenced that I had no idea, I mean, which student made that comment, because the student never used their workplace or their political orientation to problematize their learning. So in response in 2019, I added a fifth reflection that we call the cultural engagement. So how did your cultural, racial, sexual, political, or disability orientation shape how you engaged in this assignment? And then I engaged in repositioning, reflecting the 2018 paper, the CPDE paper, where I encouraged students to use their diverse identities to problematize learning. And this modest feature actually led to a massive increase in socio-political uncertainties. We went from about 11%, mostly associated with a part of one of the assignments on reliability and bias. Obviously, the textbook talked about racial bias, and that came up in students' responses. In the 2019 version, students were talking about racial bias in other assignments, and it went up to about 45% of the weekly posts included some form of a socio-political uncertainty, either in the Wikifolio assignment or the discussion threads. And that's excluding ones that were in response to my instructor comments encouraging repositioning. Several students used diverse identities to problematize content. 2 of the students introduced themselves as identifying with LGBTQ plus community and used that perspective to problematize assignments where it was relevant. One student in the reliability and bias assignment in the cultural reflection introduced a very strongly conservative political orientation. to the point that the student actually refused to complete the part of the assignment on assessment bias. And I really botched this immediately in retrospect. In my defense, I was traveling at the time. I was in the Italian Alps on a satellite hookup with several people waiting behind me, but the student said, life is not fair. So I'm not going to complete the part of the assignment. In retrospect, just an awful decision on my part. I clearly should have responded and said, no, differential item functioning is not politically correct. It's something that any graduate student who's taken a course in assessment should know. But I was so happy to encourage in this repositioning, and this really illustrates one of the challenges of repositioning versus inviting students to position themselves. I just encourage the student to explore how their political orientation shaped their engagement. And really the real stumble here is that the reflection was just really a terrible idea. My advisee, Saraju Timchandani, pointed out really as the class was ending, it's like, no, you just can't require students and even ask students to speak for the groups that they identify with. And that's really a cardinal rule of culturally relevant education. So it really risks tokenization or really worse. So lesson learned there. In response, in 2020 and 2021, we revised the cultural reflection. Knowledge and learning are inherently cultural and social. How did these factors impact how you engage in this assignment? How might what you learned this week contribute to making education more inclusive? I extended the respect for diversity statement to say you will never be required to speak for or represent any identity or perspective and should never require or ask your classmates to do so. It looks like it's effective. We haven't analyzed it as carefully as we did, as we report in the paper, the 2018 and 2019 results. Students are using diverse identities and histories to problematize. There's still plenty of sociopolitical uncertainties. And in my feedback, I'm trying less to reposition students as in my botched example in 2019, but more inviting and encouraging students to position themselves as having unique perspectives, drawing on their diverse experiences. So for the past really almost year since the end of the summer version in 2021, I've really been systematically re-examining the course and looking for additional opportunities to introduce sociopolitical uncertainties, as I'll show you. I added a course objective that actually is an objective in the course for assessment equity, and in this process have produced this set of design principles that I'm going to talk about today. The first principle is, not surprisingly, use sociopolitical uncertainties to problematize content in instruction and assessment. And so these are guiding principles that draw very directly from the 2019 article. One of the really helpful things of that article is the set of guiding principles. And here you see this is drawn directly from the 2019 articles. These are direct quotes. Thank you, Priyanka. So there you can see the very first PDE principle, problematizing, take up and seek resolution of disciplinary uncertainties. So they have extended those principles using epistemic diversity and historicity and identity. And then the real beauty is that for each of those things, they've provided these guiding questions. So what epistemic or cultural assumptions underlie the disciplinary uncertainty? And for historicity and identity, what identities or histories are implicated by the epistemic or cultural assumptions underlying the disciplinary uncertainties or the socio-political dimensions they surface? So this is what this ended up looking like in the assignment I showed you before. So we're extending each of the items using socio-political uncertainties. In this case, create a short answer item for learners who identify with minoritized communities. First, describe a real or imagined minoritized learner in your context. Then create a short answer item that is relevant or sustaining to that learner's cultures using the following guidelines. Again, drawing very directly from the CPDE framework. Then indicate which guideline was most helpful for you and why. So I've been piloting these items in close collaboration with Morgan Lau, a first-year LS student who completed P507 actually before she came and joined our program, and we've been going back through. And Morgan is a Chinese-American student who teaches English online, primarily in China to Chinese native speakers. And in this case, so she's elected to extend her short answer item on pronunciation from her students for the ethnic Miao learners. And so she's gone in and extended it. And then if you look at the guidelines, so she selected the guideline, expand your view of your discipline to avoid erasure of cultural uncertainties was most helpful for me. There's a really nice elaboration here about issues facing non-dominant language speakers in China. And what's happening here is Morgan is really bringing in her own experience, her own unique experience as not only the only Chinese American in the class, but the only Chinese American who's been teaching English in China. So she's bringing in this unique experience to extend this assignment. Similarly, we've extended the assignments in the second module on assessment principles, in this case, validity. In a similar manner, students are asked to, in the second module, to revisit, in the validity assignment, to revisit each of the assessments they created in the first module and apply the guidelines for different forms of validity evidence, which is the most relevant form of validity evidence for each of these items. And they're asked to revisit that evidence for diverse learners and revisit your responses to the previous two items and imagine how they might be different. And again, these are the same guidelines that we saw before. And again, indicate which of these guidelines was most helpful and why. So here you can see that Morgan has gone in and the real exciting thing about these examples so far for me is how much more deeply Morgan's going into her context in order to complete these extensions to the assignment. And so you can see that she's gone in and looked very hard in the very last example there. A really interesting point here about the challenges that Uyghur students face because they have to translate from Uyghur to Mandarin to English to be successful in this context. And she's talked about some really deep, important aspects of the language. Now that in turn required deeper engagement with the concepts of the chapter. So revisit validity evidence for diverse learners. Revisit your responses to the previous items, where it says, I would not change my ranking of the sources of validity too much. Indeed, I would still rank test content and response processes as the most important evidence for my aim. However, I would pay more attention to relations to other variables, as it's important to see how these students will be predicted to perform outside the classroom. And then below, I will actually change response process as the most relevant validity evidence. Right, so to think about how these forms of validity evidence, and in my experience, validity is really the really challenging thing in this course. You know, when I first started teaching this course, I was happy if students knew the difference between reliability and validity. But if you look into that, Morgan really had to think very hard about the forms of validity evidence. And in thinking about the way that they related to minoritized learners, really engaged with these fairly complicated concepts in a way that is almost certain to transfer both to majoritized and minoritized contexts. And then finally, we see here with this extension, this revisiting, Morgan engaging with the CPDE guidelines. The guideline used multiple ways of counting, measuring, or arguing to make contact with political or social realities was most helpful as it extend my thinking about validity and connect to the political realities that many minority students are experiencing. So we don't really have time to do justice to all four of the principles, but the second principle is support broad transfer in of diverse funds of knowledge and identity. And this is where we really drew on the funds of knowledge and identity framework. I really found Moulton's remix of it as providing some really helpful examples. And here you can see in Morgan's cultural reflection that indeed this assignment did uh, allow her to bring in diverse funds of knowledge and identity and history to bear on this assignment. And with this reflection, then I can then, I don't need to reposition, but I can encourage and reward and celebrate that kind of engagement. The third CSCA principle is create opportunities for students with minoritized identities to have authority in formal and informal feedback. And there's the set of guidelines drawing from the 2019 paper. This may be a little hard for some of you to read, but it really gets at the key thing, and that is that Morgan has in her commentary, in her discussion of the work, she's described some unique experiences that she has. And in my response, right, so I'm acknowledging her authority. That's super interesting. I had thought otherwise. I really learned something from you. So this is where I'm spending all of my time in this class, is trying to position students as having unique authority. I might have gone further. I sort of could have pushed her to say, well, how would you apply these principles to teaching your own students? But you can see from this exchange that in our interaction, I'm really helping. In my informal feedback, I'm really trying to position her as having unique authority. The fourth principle is ensure equitable accountability by holding all students accountable. So what this means in practice is that my summative exams should include reference to these other sociopolitical controversies. And this is where I guess I'm struggling. I'm debating making these bonus points, but we're including other options. So for instance, I mentioned the example I use. Other things we're doing is the racist motivations of Lewis Terman in early achievement testing, the use of interim assessments to track underrepresented students. So in each assignment, we're adding an optional socio-political uncertainty. We're including them in the formative self-assessments. And I think now we're going to include them as like bonus items in the summative exam. And I'll be interested to see how this goes. I know that that raises potential controversies with students, and I'll be curious what others think about this. And Jennifer Randall has really convinced me that, ostensibly neutral assessments are actually biased towards white male perspectives, and there's no reason that we can't apply that argument to our own classroom assessments. Again, it remains to be seen. I think I'll make them bonus points in this coming semester and see what the reaction is. So I'll close with sort of some practical issues. In addition to assuming that I'm going to make the new CPDE elements optional, that you have to complete to get an A+ in each of the assignments, and making the items in the assessment bonus points. I'm curious what people think, but there are other practical issues. I'm looking forward to adding a module we've been very involved in professional development. We're currently working on an additional module on culturally sustaining assessment for preparing teachers to teach online. One of the exciting things about this work is I'm really obsessed with test preparation throughout my career. It's really just done to the excess in students that serve large numbers of students that identify with minority communities. And I think that if we were to redirect that time and energy to culturally sustaining educational assessment, we might really have a big impact. And we might have a way of redirecting the use of interim assessments to support those goals. Certainly we need to do this in design-based implementation research, really as partnership with the teachers. So I'll close with our 4 design principles. I hope that you find these useful. Looking forward to seeing how these play out in P507 this coming summer, and looking forward to hearing what people have to say about them. Thank you very much.